Have you ever thought of, did the Middle Ages had their own Middle Ages? Because I did, and if you did too, welcome. So, I've watched the most recent The Odyssey in IMAX. Wanted to have the premium seat but was taken already. I underestimated it. With so much hate this film is getting when it's not out yet, the cinema I was in was huge. But it's full. Never had a full cinema like that in ages. Probably last was Spider-Man. No Way Home. For a hated movie, the story is loved. Before watching, I've visited a Mediterranean place to eat, of course. Here's a gyro platter consisting of strips of beef, chicken, tuna, falafel, grilled zucchini, carrots, and eggplant, served with tea tzatziki and shepherd's salad, panna cotta, tartufo, lassi. Now, the Middle Ages had their own Middle Ages, and it was the Odyssey. When we think of history, many of us picture knights, castles, and the Middle Ages. At least I do. And if you are watching this, then probably you too. But have you ever wondered what was history to these people who we now consider historical? To the people living in the Middle Ages, they also had their own Middle Ages. Just as we look back at medieval castles today, medieval people looked back at the ruins of ancient Rome and the legends of ancient Greece. To them, those civilizations were unimaginably old, and among the greatest stories from that distant past was the Odyssey. Today we have medieval fantasy, but the medieval people also had their own medieval fantasy, a tale so old that medieval scholars copied it by hand, Renaissance artists admired it, and today it's still being brought to life in cinema. But what exactly is the Odyssey? If you already know this or want to skip this part, feel free to skip to the second part of this video for another perspective about the Odyssey and Odysseus' enemies. Going back to what the Odyssey is, it begins after the Trojan War. The Greek hero Odysseus has won and wants only one thing, to return home to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. It should have taken weeks. Instead, it took 10 years, a decade. And it's not as if he lost, he was also not lost. But because the gods had other plans, after Odysseus blinded the Cyclops Polyphemus, he unknowingly made an enemy of Poseidon, the god of the sea. From that moment on, every voyage became a struggle for survival. Can you imagine? The ocean is literally your only way to get back home. But your enemy is the very god of its storms, shipwrecks, monsters, temptation, magic. In the ocean you are challenged, but if you land, every island still brought a new challenge. One of the most famous was the Cyclops, a one-eyed giant who trapped Odysseus and his men inside a cave. Unable to overpower the monster, Odysseus relied on intelligence instead of strength. He famously introduced himself as nobody. After blinding the Cyclops and escaping beneath sheep, the giant cried out that nobody had attacked him, causing the other Cyclopes to ignore his pleas for help. It's one of history's oldest examples of a clever trick defeating brute force.
Then came the Sirens, creatures whose beautiful songs lured sailors to their deaths. Knowing the danger, Odysseus ordered his crew to plug their ears with beeswax while he alone was tied tightly to the ship's mast. He wanted to hear the song, without following it. Another unforgettable challenge was Scylla and Charybdis. On one side lurked a six-headed monster. On the other, a giant whirlpool capable of swallowing entire ships. Choosing between them became so famous that even today we use the phrase between Scylla and Charybdis to describe being trapped between two terrible options. Oh, you didn't know. Now you do. You're welcome. Odysseus also encountered the witch Circe, who transformed his men into pigs, the lotus eaters whose fruit made travelers forget their homes forever, and Calypso, a goddess who offered him immortality if he stayed with her. He refused.
I'll say yes, you're probably thinking now. If I was him. But he refused because he wanted to go home. That's one of the reasons the Odyssey has endured for nearly 3,000 years, beneath all the monsters and magic. It's a deeply human story about perseverance, loyalty, and the longing to return home. But was any of it real? Of course. Of course, the monsters almost certainly belonged to mythology. Yet the world around them was very real. Ancient Greece existed. The Mycenaean civilization flourished during the Late Bronze Age, and Troy itself, once thought to be purely mythical, was eventually identified by archaeologists in what is now Turkey. Whether the Trojan War happened exactly as Homer described remains debated, but many historians believe the legend may preserve memories of a real conflict. Even Homer himself remains a mystery. We don't know for certain whether he was a single person, several poets whose works became combined, or even a legendary figure. For centuries, these stories were passed down orally before finally being written, and perhaps that's the most remarkable part. When medieval scholars read the Odyssey, it's as if they were reading a modern fantasy novel, but also reading what they believed to be part of humanity's ancient heritage. To them, Odysseus belonged to a world that had already vanished over 1,000 years earlier, just as medieval knights now belong to ours. Today, we have the medieval knights, but what did the medieval knights have? Probably the Odyssey. The Odyssey could be their Arthurian legend. Today, we have the Arthurian legend, so old. But them, they had Odyssey, ancient. That's history. And perhaps one day, 1,000 years from now, people will look back at our stories the same way medieval people looked back at the Odyssey. Do you have a theory how the future people will see us? What would we be called? Now, you skipped here or maybe didn't. Let's talk another perspective about the Odyssey. Odysseus' enemies. One thing that makes Greek mythology so compelling is their monsters. But almost no monster exists just to be a monster. Most of Odysseus' enemies have their own origins, families, motives, tragedies. Polyphemus, the Cyclops. Most people know him as the one-eyed giant. Was he just a cruel monster? He was the son of Poseidon, god of the sea, and the sea nymph Thoosa. When Odysseus blinded him, he didn't merely escape a giant, he injured the son of one of the most powerful Olympian gods. That's why Poseidon spent years making Odysseus' journey home a nightmare. If you think what happened to him is tragic, or not, he is also his own being. Polyphemus later became a tragic romantic figure in other Greek myths where he falls in love with the sea nymph Galatea. But she loves someone else instead. Broken eye, broken-hearted. Sorry, gotta make that pun. But that's what most of us do not think about. Polyphemus also has his own life.
Circe. She's remembered as the witch who turned Odysseus' men into pigs. But in Greek mythology, Circe was not simply an evil sorceress. She was a daughter of Helios, the titan and personification of the sun. She possessed divine powers and extensive knowledge of herbs, potions, and magic. Some later traditions even say she and Odysseus had children after he stayed on her island. Calypso. She seems like a villain because she keeps Odysseus captive for years. But she's also one of mythology's most tragic figures. She genuinely loved Odysseus. When Zeus ordered her to let him leave, she obeyed. Even if it breaks her heart, she even gave him supplies to help him get home safely. The Sirens. People often imagine them as beautiful mermaids. Originally, they weren't. In ancient Greek art, they were usually depicted as birds with women's heads. The fish-tailed image became popular much later, during the Middle Ages and beyond. Yes, the mermaid form is from the medieval period. Their bird form symbolized their connection with song, as birds were closely associated with music and the soul. This is also how they appear in much of ancient Greek art from around the 6th to 4th centuries BC. So what changed? During the Middle Ages, different mythical traditions gradually merged. Medieval Europe inherited stories from ancient Greece and Rome, but also had its own folklore about mermaids and other water spirits. As Greek myths were copied, translated, and retold, artists increasingly portrayed sirens as half-woman, half-fish, partly because they were associated with the sea and tempting sailors. In medieval Christian art, sirens became symbols of lust, temptation, and vanity. A fish-tailed woman was a more familiar and powerful image for conveying those moral lessons than a birdwoman. By the late medieval period, the fish-tailed siren had become common in manuscripts, church carvings, and bestiaries. By the Renaissance and later centuries, this version had largely replaced the ancient birdwoman in popular imagination. Today, when someone hears siren, they usually picture something very similar to a mermaid, even though that's not how the ancient Greeks originally imagined them. This is something the medieval world changed. The sirens Odysseus encountered weren't originally mermaids at all. To the ancient Greeks, they were bird women. It was medieval Europe that gradually transformed them into the fish-tailed sirens we're familiar with today. This is a great example of how the medieval world didn't just preserve ancient myths, it reshaped them as well. Maybe how we romanticize the medieval period today. The Middle Ages also had their own version of romanticizing their own Middle Ages. The ancient times. Scylla is a monster, but was not always. According to one famous myth, she was once a beautiful sea nymph. The sea god Glaucus fell in love with her. The witch Circe also loved Glaucus. Out of jealousy, Circe poisoned the water where Scylla bathed, transforming her into the six-headed creature forever. Charybdis. If you find the whirlpool boring because it's a natural disaster and not a living creature like the other enemies of Odysseus, well, she was not always like that. Yes, Charybdis herself was a being. One myth says she was the daughter of Poseidon and Gaia. She flooded lands to help her father. Zeus punished her by turning her into the monster that eternally swallows and spits out the sea. The lotus eaters. They're among the few enemies who never attack anyone. They are peaceful. The real danger is their lotus plant. Anyone who eats it loses all desire to return home. It's less about violence and more about forgetting who you are.
The Laestrygonians. Once you know them, they'll either be your favorite or your fear. They're often overshadowed by the Cyclops, yet they were arguably far more devastating. These giant cannibals almost destroyed Odysseus' entire fleet. Only his own ship escaped. This was one of the greatest losses of the entire journey. Poseidon, the main antagonist, is a god. Let that sink in. Interestingly, Poseidon isn't portrayed as purely evil. From his perspective, Odysseus had blinded his son. The vengeance that follows is brutal, but in Greek mythology, avenging one's family was considered understandable, especially for a god.
Athena. What? No, she's not an enemy. Yes, she is not. She's often seen as Odysseus' ally. But she doesn't really simply rescue him. Athena helps because Odysseus embodies qualities she values most: intelligence, strategy, patience, cleverness. Odysseus wins many of his greatest victories with his mind rather than brute strength.
One thing many people don't notice is that Odysseus' enemies mirror different human weaknesses. Polyphemus mirrors arrogance and lack of hospitality.
The Sirens. Temptation, lotus eaters, complacency and forgetting your purpose. Circe mirrors indulgence and transformation. Calypso, comfort versus duty. Scylla and Charybdis, impossible choices.
And Poseidon, the consequences of pride and revenge. Yes, the journey is about fighting monsters, but it's also about resisting different kinds of temptations and dangers, both physical and psychological. This is a perspective blending history, mythology, and the deeper storytelling traditions behind what later inspired so much fantasy literature. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like and comment. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story and more. Share this with a fellow history, fantasy, or Odyssey fan. May it be this newest, the Odyssey film, the older films, Epic the musical, or other forms. Great thanks for being part of this world. More incredible stories on the way. Did you watch the newest film? How was it?